Grace Markson discovered the betrayal on the same morning. She legally became the owner of half of James' bank's empire. The timing would have been laughable if it wasn't so precise. At 7:14 a.m., Grace stood barefoot in her kitchen, phone in hand, scrolling through an image she hadn't asked to see but couldn't ignore. Olivia Gray, her best friend of 8 years, was seated too comfortably across from James Banks at a private table, their bodies angled inward, heads close, familiarity written all over the space between them. Nothing explicit, nothing undeniable, and yet everything was clear. Grace didn't gasp. She didn't drop the phone. She didn't feel shock the way people expected betrayal to feel. Instead, she exhaled slowly, set the phone down beside a stack of signed documents, and poured herself a cup of coffee. By 7:18 a.m., Grace Markson owned assets that neither Olivia nor James fully understood yet. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. Grace had always known that noise distracted people from truth. That was why she lived quietly. No social performances, no public displays of success, no need to be seen. At 32, she had perfected the art of invisibility in rooms where decisions were made. People mistook her restraint for simplicity. They always did. She dressed that morning with her usual discipline, neutral tones, clean lines, nothing that suggested excess. She left her apartment without hurry, the city moving around her like background sound. Grace did not rush because she rarely arrived unprepared. James Banks, on the other hand, lived in a world where people watched him constantly. To the public, James was the definition of controlled success, a billionaire built on strategy, discipline, and sharp instincts. He spoke carefully, moved deliberately, and gave the impression of a man who always knew what he was doing. Interviews painted him as self-made. Headlines praised his vision. What they didn't say was how many of his most critical turning points traced back to decisions Grace Markson had made quietly, long before James realized he needed them. James met Grace years earlier, drawn first by her restraint, then by her mind. Their relationship never announced itself. It didn't require explanation. They operated in understanding rather than reassurance. Grace never asked for promises. James never demanded visibility. What they shared was built slowly, deliberately, like everything else Grace allowed into her life. Which was why Olivia Gray's presence complicated things in a way Grace hadn't anticipated. Olivia had been Grace's closest friend long before James entered the picture. She was expressive where Grace was reserved, emotional where Grace was controlled. Olivia talked easily, laughed loudly, filled space without apology. Grace had always believed that difference made them stronger. Olivia knew Grace's routines, her habits, the way she preferred order over chaos. What Olivia didn't know, what Grace never felt compelled to explain, was how much of Grace's life existed beneath the surface. That morning, Grace arrived at a quiet office downtown, greeted by a legal advisor who didn't ask unnecessary questions. Papers were reviewed, final confirmations were made, names were signed, ownership was transferred. No ceremony, no witnesses who mattered. By the time Grace left the building, her phone vibrated again. A message from James. "Are you free later today?" Grace read it once, then locked her phone. She didn't respond immediately, not because she was angry, but because she understood timing. Grace believed that information carried more weight when revealed at the right moment. Later that afternoon, Olivia called. "Grace," Olivia said brightly, her tone familiar, effortless. "You busy?" "Not particularly," Grace replied. "I was thinking we should hang out tonight, just us. It feels like we haven't really talked." Grace paused for half a second, just enough to register the irony. "That sounds fine," she said. Olivia laughed. "Good. Oh, and I might invite James. I ran into him recently. He's interesting." Grace's expression didn't change. "Yes," she replied calmly, "he is." When the call ended, Grace sat alone in her car, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. She felt no urge to confront anyone, no impulse to claim territory. Grace had never believed in fighting over what was already hers. What Olivia and James didn't yet understand was that Grace Markson didn't compete loudly. She didn't announce power. She let people move first, then showed them what they had stepped into. The city lights flickered on as evening approached, unaware that 3 lives had quietly crossed a threshold. And none of them, not even James Banks, fully understood the consequences yet. The city hummed beneath James Banks' apartment as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, glass of whiskey in hand. The skyline glittered, but his attention wasn't on the lights. His mind was on Grace, on the quiet certainty she carried into every space, and on Olivia Gray, who seemed to appear everywhere he didn't expect. He had known Grace long enough to recognize her patterns, her control, her restraint. But knowing someone and predicting their moves were 2 different things. Grace had a way of acting like she wasn't involved in the chaos, but she had always been 3 steps ahead of him and everyone else. James took a slow sip, his eyes narrowing on the street below, thinking about how easily people misread him. To the world, he was decisive, dominant, untouchable. Articles painted him as a self-made billionaire with perfect instincts, a man whose empire expanded through vision alone. What the world didn't see was Grace. Her fingerprints were on his decisions long before he signed contracts or made announcements. She had positioned him carefully, structured outcomes he thought were his ideas, and silently ensured that he would always succeed. James sometimes wondered if he had ever truly earned the victories everyone attributed to him, or if he was merely the face of a strategy he didn't fully understand. The thought was fleeting, drowned out by the memory of Olivia. He hadn't expected her to be so persistent. Her energy was different from Grace. Brash, extroverted, warm, easy to talk to, she drew people in without effort. She had a way of making the world feel smaller, as if the boundaries Grace so carefully built could be ignored. James found himself uneasy with the thought. Olivia didn't know the extent of Grace's influence. She couldn't see the legal strings quietly attached to his empire, the subtle power moves that had kept everything he owned tethered in Grace's orbit. And that ignorance made her dangerous in a way he hadn't anticipated. The phone buzzed again, a text from Grace. Dinner later, simple, direct, calm. He set down his glass and replied immediately, "Yes." James had a reputation for control, for meticulous planning, but when it came to Grace, control was an illusion. She forced him to think differently, to act cautiously, to consider outcomes he would otherwise ignore. She challenged him without confrontation, led him without a leash. And yet, despite all that, he wanted her beside him that night, not as a partner in power, but as herself. When he arrived at the small, quiet restaurant Grace had chosen, he saw her already seated, her posture poised, eyes scanning the menu as if evaluating something he couldn't see. Olivia was already there, animated as ever, mid-laugh at a comment James couldn't hear. Grace looked up when he approached, offering a small smile that made the room feel quieter, more controlled. James slid into the seat beside her. Olivia's eyes flicked toward him, bright, curious, unguarded. "James," she said, voice light, "good to see you again." "Likewise," he replied, neutral, masking the unease that had settled in his chest. Throughout dinner, James felt the familiar tension between what the world expected of him and what Grace represented. To everyone else, he could flirt, joke, charm, dominate conversations. But next to Grace, everything became intentional. Every smile, every word, every glance carried meaning he couldn't ignore. Olivia didn't notice it. She moved freely, unaware that every interaction she had with him was being subtly tracked by Grace, mentally catalogued, evaluated, and silently judged. James caught Grace's gaze across the table. There was no accusation there, just awareness. Calm, precise, unshakable awareness. It reminded him why he respected her, why he needed her, why in ways no one else could understand she was the axis of his life. And yet sitting there, he also realized something uncomfortable. Olivia's energy had a pull, not over him, not in a serious way, but enough to make him question just slightly. How much chaos could enter their controlled world without him noticing? Grace, for her part, remained still, unreadable, holding her attention between Olivia and James with the practiced subtlety of someone who had already calculated every risk. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. The weight of her presence was enough to remind him, and Olivia, who quietly held the real power in the room. By the time dinner ended, James felt a mixture of anticipation and unease. Grace had not moved, had not announced anything. Yet he knew one simple truth. Everything he thought he controlled that evening, his schedule, his interactions, even his desires, was already influenced by Grace Markson. And Olivia Gray, blissfully unaware, had just stepped into a space she didn't fully understand. James drove home in silence, thinking about how little the world actually saw. Most people thought they knew him. They didn't. Most people thought they understood power. They didn't. And one friend, seated in that small restaurant with charm, warmth, and misplaced confidence, had no idea she was playing in a game she could never win. By the time he arrived at his apartment, James understood something he hadn't admitted even to himself. Grace was not only indispensable, she was untouchable, and anyone who tried to step between them would be learning that lesson the hard way. The next morning, Grace woke to a city humming with predictable routine, yet nothing about her own life felt predictable. She had handled James' subtle unease the night before, managed Olivia's misplaced energy, and continued her quiet accumulation of power without anyone realizing it. Still, there was an itch she couldn't ignore, the one that whispered, "People can misjudge what they cannot see." Olivia arrived at Grace's apartment before 10, as usual, flinging the door open without hesitation. Grace didn't even bother rising immediately. She watched her best friend as she swept in, coat flung over a shoulder, hair perfectly tousled in deliberate chaos. "Grace," Olivia called, voice carrying in the airy space. "You won't believe the morning I had. Honestly, I could tell you, but you'd probably judge me." Grace finally lifted her head, smoothing her blouse as she met Olivia's gaze. "Try me," she said, voice steady, calm. No judgment required. It was one of the rare things Grace gave freely, the space to be reckless without consequence. Olivia laughed, flopping onto the sofa. "So James," she didn't pause, didn't even whisper the name, though her tone carried curiosity. "He was charming. He's different than I expected." Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't respond immediately. She wasn't angry. She wasn't anxious. She was assessing. Olivia's words weren't dangerous yet. They were casual, innocent, but they revealed a tendency, a pattern. Olivia had a way of stepping into proximity and claiming ownership without thinking. Grace had known it all along. She simply observed. "You're reading too much into it," Olivia continued, oblivious. "It's just conversation, you know. I barely know him, but he seems intense." Grace leaned back, fingers entwined. Intense can be dangerous if you're not aware of boundaries. Olivia blinked, playful yet oblivious. "Boundaries? You mean like the ones you always talk about but never actually enforce?" Grace's smile was faint, controlled. "Exactly, that's why I said it." They had always had this rhythm. Olivia was loud, Grace was quiet. Olivia reached, Grace calculated. Olivia assumed openness meant permission. Grace often gave only awareness. Their friendship was built on years of trust, shared confidence, and mutual survival in ways few outsiders could understand. Yet within this trust lay the fragility Olivia didn't notice, a fragility that now had the faintest hint of tension. Olivia laughed again, entirely unaware. "You're always so serious. I swear, sometimes I forget you even have a personal life outside everything." "I do," Grace said calmly. "It's just private, intentional, that's different than serious." Olivia tilted her head, eyes sparkling with curiosity and mischief. "So, you mean like your life with James?" She didn't hesitate. Her words danced over the line without warning, careless in tone but probing in effect. Grace's gaze remained steady. Olivia had no idea how careful Grace had been, how every move with James was calculated and deliberate. She didn't flinch, didn't scold. Instead, she observed. She had learned that people revealed their intentions long before they realized it themselves. Olivia's excitement, her energy, her lack of discretion, all signs she had yet to fully understand the landscape she was stepping into. Olivia leaned back, grinning. "You really think you can keep everything in control forever? Life's not like that, Grace." Grace's fingers drummed lightly against the table. Maybe, or maybe life just hasn't met the right observer yet. Olivia laughed, shaking her head. "You always sound like some kind of fortune teller, or a secret billionaire or something. Honestly, if I didn't know you, I'd probably think you were hiding treasure maps under your bed." Grace allowed herself the smallest smirk, acknowledging the joke but not letting it distract her. She had learned the value of patience. Olivia's energy could either be dangerous or harmless. It depended entirely on how Grace chose to respond. For the rest of the morning, they spoke about trivialities, upcoming meetings, mutual acquaintances, plans that didn't matter in the larger scheme, but the undercurrent remained. Olivia's proximity to James, her natural charm and boldness, would eventually require attention. Grace didn't panic. She had seen patterns before. She could predict moves without needing to confront them. It was this very trust, this confidence in her own foresight, that allowed Grace to let Olivia remain close. The best friend believed she had full access, that years of intimacy granted her rights she did not yet fully possess. Grace allowed it, for now. Observing was far more effective than reacting. By noon, Olivia left, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts. The apartment felt unusually still, as if the city itself had paused to watch the delicate balance of trust and control in Grace's life. She poured herself tea, letting the warmth ground her. Her mind returned to James, to the subtle ways he deferred to her decisions without realizing it, to the power she quietly maintained over all outcomes. And then, almost imperceptibly, Grace allowed herself a private acknowledgement. Olivia was not dangerous yet, but she could become a threat. One wrong step, one unchecked desire, one failure to recognize boundaries, and the careful world Grace had built could be challenged in ways she hadn't yet allowed herself to imagine. She didn't fear it, she welcomed it. Observation, patience, calculation, these were her weapons. Olivia Gray had always been like a storm trapped inside a familiar shape. Grace simply needed to let it pass over her, study it, and decide when, if ever, intervention was necessary. Grace's calm did not waver. She didn't need to chase control. She already held it. And in that quiet certainty, she knew one undeniable truth. Even when trust was tested, the woman who built quietly could always see more than anyone else. Grace Markson noticed the change before anyone spoke of it. It wasn't in the words Olivia said, but in the way she lingered near James Banks, in the warmth that edged her tone when she mentioned his name. At first, it was subtle, a laugh that lasted too long, a glance that strayed in his direction, but Grace had learned to read these signs long ago. James, for his part, was oblivious, or perhaps deliberately blind. He treated Olivia with casual charm, the kind he reserved for acquaintances and strangers alike. Yet the ease between them made space for a different kind of energy, one that was closer than casual but stopped short of outright confession. Grace recognized the danger immediately. It began during one of the city's quieter evenings. Grace had invited James to her apartment to review some documents, and Olivia had joined, citing her own urgent project nearby. Grace had agreed, rationalizing that Olivia's presence posed no real threat. She underestimated the subtle pull of human desire. Olivia arrived first, her energy bright and unrestrained. She laughed at minor jokes James hadn't even made yet and reached for details of his life that weren't really hers to know. Grace observed quietly from the armchair, letting them occupy the same space, letting Olivia spill into it like light into shadow. James, distracted by Olivia's intensity, laughed more freely than he had in weeks. Grace noticed how his shoulders relaxed, how his smiles lasted longer, how the subtle warmth in his voice edged toward intimacy. It wasn't intentional, at least not consciously, but it was there, undeniable. Olivia leaned back in her seat, tilting her head toward him. "You've changed," she said softly, almost casually, almost as if she didn't know what she was saying. "I didn't expect this side of you." James gave her a small, bemused smile. "People rarely show everything at once," he replied, careful, "but some sides are better left private." Olivia didn't push. She simply lingered, the unspoken words between them vibrating like electricity in the air. Grace felt the shift immediately, not fear, not anger, but awareness. She had built her world on observation, on timing, on patience. And now, the first lines of a potential chaos had begun to appear. Grace stood slowly, crossing the room to pour herself a glass of water. "Are we finished here?" she asked, voice calm, measured. She didn't look accusing. She didn't raise her tone. Her presence alone reminded them both of boundaries. Olivia smiled innocently. "Of course, you don't have to be so serious all the time." Grace's eyes lingered on her, unflinching. "Seriousness doesn't determine loyalty," she said simply, letting the words hang between them. Olivia caught them, thought them harmless, but they carried weight Grace did not intend to explain. The rest of the evening continued in a delicate dance. Olivia floated closer to James during conversations, shared laughs, anecdotes, and opinions with him as if she had known him for years beyond their brief acquaintance. James responded in kind, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, the danger in their growing familiarity. Grace remained silent. She didn't intervene. Not yet. Observation was her method. Let them move, let them assume, let them make their own choices. Every action, every glance, every unguarded smile was information she collected, and she had never been wrong about what people revealed before they realized it themselves. By the end of the evening, Olivia's presence lingered in James' thoughts long after she had left. Grace noted it too, not with alarm, not with resentment, but with precision. She understood now that desire, even unspoken, was a weapon when wielded without awareness. Olivia wielded it unconsciously, and James responded with the same oblivion she had seen countless times before in others who failed to recognize the quiet gravity Grace carried. Alone later that night, Grace reviewed documents in the dim glow of her study lamp. She considered the implications: Olivia's proximity, James' reactions, the invisible tension threading the room that evening. No one had spoken of betrayal, and none had even realized it had begun. But Grace understood that lines had shifted, boundaries had blurred. And in her quiet, deliberate world, Grace Markson knew this truth clearly. She did not need to control the emotions of others to protect what was hers. Observation, timing, patience, they were enough. Olivia had already begun moving in a direction Grace hadn't anticipated. James, blissfully unaware, allowed her to do so. And yet, Grace felt no panic. She had seen this before. People always revealed their intentions. All that remained was knowing when to act, when to let the storm pass, and when to claim what was quietly hers from the beginning. The danger was real, the tension undeniable, and the lines, once sharp and defined, were now beginning to blur. Grace didn't flinch. She only watched, knowing that every subtle shift carried consequences she was more than ready to meet. The morning began like any other, except it was. Grace Markson noticed the subtle change immediately. The way Olivia Gray's texts arrived with an unusual eagerness. The way James' tone carried just a hint of hesitation when he answered her call. Grace had always been attuned to the unspoken, the hidden, the small shifts that revealed everything people thought they could hide. She arrived at her office building, a quiet glass tower tucked into the city's midsection, to find James waiting for her. He stood near the elevators, hands tucked into his suit pockets, expression neutral but tense. "Morning," he said, voice low, measured. Not casual. Grace didn't miss the slight stiffness in his posture. "Morning," she replied evenly, studying him carefully. "Something's off," James said finally. "I don't know how to explain it." Grace tilted her head, calm, unflinching. She had always known when someone underestimated their own actions. "Explain what?" she asked. He hesitated, choosing his words like they were fragile objects. "Olivia, she's different around me. Not like before. I didn't think it was a problem, but—" He trailed off, finally letting the weight of unspoken concern hang between them. Grace said nothing. She didn't need to, she already understood. Later that afternoon, she arrived at a small, understated cafe where Olivia had asked to meet for a quick chat. Olivia looked up when Grace approached, cheerful and oblivious, but the energy between them felt different. She leaned in slightly, her laughter lighter, her movements closer to James than necessary. Grace observed everything, silent, unshaken. "You look tense," Olivia said, almost casually, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Everything okay?" Grace took a seat, fingers lightly tapping the table. "I'm fine," she said. "You?" Olivia laughed, but there was a nervous edge now. "Me? Oh, I'm fine, just excited, you know. Things are moving quickly." Grace's eyes narrowed subtly. "Quickly how?" Olivia shrugged, pretending casual innocence, but her gaze betrayed her. Grace caught it immediately. The way she lingered in the moment, the unspoken satisfaction she carried, the quiet thrill of overstepping a boundary she hadn't realized existed until now. Grace didn't react outwardly. She had learned that reaction gave people power they didn't deserve. Instead, she let Olivia speak, carefully gathering every word, every glance, every inflection. "It's just James and we've been talking more. I didn't mean for it to go this far, but it's—" Olivia trailed off, pretending uncertainty, while Grace could see the exact truth. Olivia was already crossing a line she had no right to approach. That evening, Grace returned home to find James packing her apartment. His eyes were sharp, restless, caught between loyalty and confusion. He began, then stopped, frustrated by the inadequacy of words. "Olivia, she crossed a line. I didn't stop it fast enough." Grace didn't flinch. She had expected this moment, even if she had hoped it wouldn't arrive so soon. She measured her response, letting calm dominate the room. "And what line is that?" she asked softly, deliberately. James ran a hand through his hair. "Physical, emotional, both. She leaned into me. I didn't act fast enough to stop her." Grace let silence stretch between them. No accusation, no outburst, just quiet observation. She had built her world on precision, patience, and the understanding that people reveal their intentions long before they acknowledge them. James had just realized the truth, but Olivia had been playing in dangerous territory for weeks without knowing it. "I see," Grace said finally. Her voice was even, controlled. Nothing in her tone hinted at the quiet storm within. "Then we adjust." James looked at her, startled by the composure she maintained. Most would have expected anger, confrontation, panic. Grace offered none. Observation, timing, and strategy were her weapons, and she wielded them silently. Later, alone, Grace allowed herself a single reflection. Betrayal had arrived, but it was minor compared to the real control she still held. Olivia had miscalculated. James had faltered, but Grace had not. She would respond, not impulsively, not emotionally, but with precision. And when she did, Olivia would realize, perhaps too late, that the quiet woman she had underestimated, Grace Markson, had already predicted this moment, prepared for it, and would ensure that every step forward Olivia imagined was, in fact, under Grace's watchful command. The first cracks were visible, the betrayal was real, but Grace didn't panic, she never panicked. She watched, she waited, she calculated, and when the time came, she would move. Everything Olivia thought she had gained that day was already slipping through her fingers. Invisible, silent, inevitable. Grace had built quietly, and even now, nothing she had built was truly in jeopardy. Grace Markson didn't scream, she did confront. She didn't beg or plead, and she certainly didn't cry. Those were actions for people who had lost control. Grace had not lost control, not even a fraction. After the confrontation that evening, Grace retreated to her apartment and allowed the city's dim glow to seep through the windows. She made herself a cup of tea, the warmth grounding her thoughts. Outside, life moved with predictable rhythm, oblivious to the subtle chaos that had begun among three intertwined lives. She thought of Olivia first, Olivia with her brightness and her careless confidence. Already believed she had shifted the balance. She assumed intimacy, closeness, and influence over James Banks without understanding the invisible strings tying them all together. Grace allowed herself a small, private smile. Observation had always been her greatest advantage. James, meanwhile, oscillated between guilt and desire. He wanted to reassure Grace, to claim a sense of order, yet the pull of familiarity with Olivia lingered in his mind. Grace knew this because she had been watching, silently, precisely, for weeks. And now she would let both of them move forward under the illusion of victory, believing that she was reacting, when in truth, she was simply waiting. Over the next days, Grace maintained a calm distance. She attended meetings, reviewed contracts, and signed documents that quietly shifted more power into her hands, all while keeping her public interactions polite but neutral. Every glance at Olivia, every word with James was measured. No overreaction, no confrontation, nothing to betray the storm she carried internally. Olivia noticed the quiet. "You're distant," she said one afternoon, adjusting her chair across from Grace at their favorite cafe. "I mean, I know you've been busy, but you barely look at me anymore. Everything okay?" Grace sipped her tea, expression neutral. "I'm fine," she said. She didn't elaborate. She never elaborated when it was unnecessary. Silence carried more weight than explanation. Olivia thought she was hurt. She thought she had intimidated Grace. But Grace was simply calculating. She let Olivia assume victory. It would make the eventual reckoning far more instructive. Later, James came to meet her, attempting small gestures of reassurance. He spoke of loyalty, of shared history, of trust. But Grace received his words as carefully as she did the documents that governed their combined assets. She allowed him to believe that conversation alone could settle matters, while inside, she cataloged every misstep, every unconscious movement, every lapse in judgment that both he and Olivia displayed. "Do you forgive me?" James asked, his voice hesitant. He had expected confrontation, anger, something to release tension. Grace gave him none of it. "I don't need forgiveness," she said softly. "I need clarity, and observation is often clearer than reaction." He blinked, momentarily unsettled. She had not scolded, not berated. She had simply reminded him, through calm dominance, that nothing was truly uncontrolled. As evening approached, Olivia tried once more, brushing against the unspoken boundaries, laughing too loudly, lingering too long in his presence. Grace observed from her own position across the room, detached but alert. Every word, every glance, every shift in posture told her exactly what she needed to know. By the time both left, Grace remained in her apartment, alone. She poured herself another cup of tea and leaned back against the window. The city lights stretched outward, ignorant of the quiet strategy unfolding inside. She thought of the betrayal, of the unspoken attraction, of the miscalculations. The storm had begun, yes, but Grace had already predicted the path. By letting both James and Olivia believe they had achieved something, she had given herself control over the narrative. She had made them believe in an illusion, one they would cling to until she chose to dissolve it. Silence, she knew, was louder than rage. Observation, sharper than confrontation. Patience, stronger than any act of immediate retaliation. And when the time came, both James and Olivia would understand exactly who had truly been in command all along. But for now, they moved forward, blissfully ignorant, and she allowed them the comfort of their own assumptions. Grace Markson had built quietly, and in this silence nothing, not betrayal, not desire, not loyalty, would undermine what she had patiently constructed. She sipped her tea and watched the city pulse below, knowing full well that the real power of observation was not in seeing chaos, but in letting chaos reveal itself to others while she remained untouchable. Olivia Gray walked into the cafe with her head high and a quiet confidence she had never allowed herself before. To her, everything had shifted. Grace Markson's measured calm, her quiet observation had been misread. Olivia assumed silence meant surrender. She assumed patience meant passivity. She believed she had claimed what she thought was hers. James Banks' attention, James Banks' desire, James Banks, she convinced herself, heart. James met her at the corner table with a smile that tried to bridge formality and intimacy. He believed as much as Olivia did that what had happened, her subtle crossings, their shared laughs, their lingering touches, was something separate from history, separate from grace, separate from consequences. To anyone looking from the outside, it was perfect, easy, comfortable, a new chapter being written without interference. But Grace Markson had never left anything to chance. She observed from across the city in her carefully appointed apartment where silence was a weapon. She didn't rush to intervene. She didn't call. She didn't confront. Grace watched, and in watching, she understood everything about the fragile web Olivia and James were weaving around themselves. Olivia leaned across the table, fingers brushing the rim of her coffee cup. "I can't believe how connected we feel," she said softly. "I didn't expect this, but it's natural, you know." James nodded, attempting a calm smile. "Yes, natural, it's comfortable." The words felt heavy, almost like a lie, but Olivia didn't notice. She didn't see the subtle way James' gaze flickered occasionally to the window behind her, to an absence she didn't understand. She didn't see the doubt simmering beneath his practiced calm, the half-conscious awareness that nothing truly begins without Grace Markson's silent orchestration. Olivia thought she had replaced Grace. She thought the space between James and Grace had been filled. She convinced herself she was now the one James desired, the one he considered important. Grace allowed this illusion to flourish. She didn't step into the cafe. She didn't disrupt. She let both of them feel the power they imagined they had claimed. The mistake, from her perspective, was not Olivia's desire, it was her ignorance. And that ignorance made the game easier to manage. By the next evening, the illusion had settled into place. Olivia laughed too loudly, leaned too close, and touched James in ways that would have made Grace tense if it weren't all part of a controlled observation. James responded politely, cautiously, with affection, but he was oblivious to the subtle lines he was crossing, to the invisible influence Grace had over every asset, every decision, every word he had ever thought was his own. And Grace, seated quietly in her own apartment, allowed herself a rare, private smile. Let them believe in this victory. Let them hold onto the sensation of control. They would enjoy it while it lasted, but in reality, they were standing on ground that was never theirs to claim. In her mind, Grace reviewed every contract, every agreement, every property and decision she had quietly secured over the years. James' world, Olivia's assumption of power, the tangled mess of desire and misjudgment. They all existed within boundaries Grace had drawn long ago. Boundaries she controlled, silently, invisibly, irrevocably. She poured herself tea, fingers brushing the rim of the cup, eyes distant but focused. Patience had always been her weapon, and now it was time for the final test. Let them taste the illusion. Let them feel the warmth of temporary victory. Soon, very soon, the walls they thought they had built around themselves would crumble. Grace Markson didn't need to fight to reclaim what was hers. She didn't need confrontation. She only needed to wait until the truth, legal, undeniable, inescapable, surfaced. And when it did, the illusion of victory would shatter, leaving no doubt about who had truly been in control all along. For now, though, Grace watched. Silence was enough. Observation was enough. Let them savor the illusion. They had no idea it would vanish with a single, quiet move. The city pulsed around her apartment, lights flickering against the glass, ignorant of the quiet storm Grace had orchestrated. In that calm, she knew one truth: the real victory never needed to be claimed loudly. It was already hers. The morning light cut across Grace Markson's study in thin, deliberate lines, dust motes dancing like quiet witnesses. She poured herself coffee, her mind already moving through numbers, contracts, and documents that most people would never see. To anyone who glanced at her life, it looked ordinary, controlled, calm. But every line she signed, every clause she drafted, carried invisible weight. Every piece of paper was a chess move. And today the game was about to tip. For weeks, she had allowed Olivia Gray to believe she had replaced her, to believe she had won James' attention. She had allowed James to think that loyalty, history, and caution had somehow shifted in Olivia's favor. They moved freely, unknowingly trapped inside boundaries Grace had constructed silently years ago, legally and psychologically, in ways neither of them realized. Grace didn't rush. She never rushed. She opened the first folder, the one marked with the smallest of notations: Assets, Banks Holdings LLC. Pages rustled under her fingertips. The documents outlined ownership, shares, voting rights, real estate, offshore accounts, every detail carefully structured to appear invisible to those outside her control. She sipped coffee, eyes scanning quickly, memorizing, calculating. Every property James thought he controlled, every decision he assumed was his alone, had a line tracing back to her. And with one signature today, one single move, she could shift the balance entirely. By late morning, she was ready. She called her legal team, not for approval but for execution. She instructed them to prepare amendments and notices that would publicly, irrevocably, and legally recognize her ownership over several key sectors of James' empire. There would be no argument, no negotiation, no, he said, she said. Everything was airtight, executed months ago, and only now revealed. Meanwhile, Olivia was at the cafe again, expecting another casual afternoon with James. She laughed, touched his arm lightly, leaned in during conversation. To her, she had won. She was sure of it. She felt the warmth of confidence and desire flowing in both directions. She had no idea that the world as she knew it was about to shift under her feet. James, too, remained unaware. He had grown comfortable, distracted by the illusion of choice. He believed his decisions were independent, his desire separate from past loyalty. Grace had allowed him that comfort. It made the eventual revelation sharper, undeniable. Grace arrived at her office just before noon. She opened the first envelope, a simple manila folder with the logo of her consulting firm. Inside were the final papers confirming the ownership of every major company in James' portfolio that she had quietly secured over the past 5 years. Properties, investments, even a significant number of international shares, everything tied back to her legal name. Grace's presence in James' empire was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. She leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a small, private smile. The storm that had begun with Olivia's crossing of boundaries was about to meet the quiet, deliberate force of law. Nothing flashy, nothing public, just truth, paperwork, precision. By mid-afternoon, her legal team began sending notices. James received the first email, initially thinking it was routine, perhaps a clerical update. Olivia got a copy shortly after, curiously CC'd, perhaps a mistake. But it was no mistake. Each document spelled out exactly who owned what, leaving no space for debate, argument, or emotional confusion. James' office went silent for a moment as he read through the files. His first reaction was disbelief. His second was irritation. And his third, subtle, uncomfortable, unavoidable, was realization. Grace Markson had always controlled the game. She had built quietly, unseen, and her legal moves were the final proof. Olivia, sipping her latte at the cafe, felt the same disbelief. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read through the documents on her phone, her confidence cracking. She had assumed power, believed she had replaced Grace in every meaningful way, and now every illusion collapsed at once. Ownership, control, influence. It had never been hers to claim. Grace, observing all of this from her office window, didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The truth had done the work for her. She had allowed both Olivia and James to believe in victory, let them taste it, and then quietly revealed the undeniable reality. The power dynamic had shifted overnight, with no argument, no confrontation, no shouting match. Just legal, undeniable truth. By evening, both James and Olivia were reeling in their own ways. James called, hesitating, trying to explain, justify, or perhaps negotiate. Grace listened quietly, letting him speak. She didn't interrupt. She didn't scold. She simply allowed him to understand, finally, that the life he thought was his independent creation had always intersected with hers. Olivia, in contrast, panicked slightly. Her laughter, her confidence, her charm, useless now in the face of legally documented reality. She realized too late that she had never taken anything that truly belonged to her. The audacity she had carried into her friendship with Grace was exposed as naive, impulsive, and ultimately powerless. Grace finally spoke to both, her voice calm, deliberate. This was never about confrontation. It was always about clarity, about truth, and truth, as you see, is undeniable. Silence followed. Both James and Olivia absorbed what had occurred fully, painfully. Grace didn't need to add drama. Her presence, her preparation, her patience, all that she had built quietly, had done more than words could ever do. By nightfall, Grace poured herself tea and sat in the calm of her apartment. She reflected on the unfolding events, the betrayal, the illusion of victory, the ultimate revelation. Every move had been deliberate. Every misstep by others had been anticipated. And now the world had acknowledged, legally and irreversibly, her power. Grace Markson had not shouted, she had not fought, she had not rushed. She had built quietly, and the truth, the paperwork, had finally spoken louder than anyone's desire, ambition, or assumption. The lines were now clear, the boundaries unmistakable, and Grace remained, as always, untouchable. The city felt heavier that morning for James Banks. He sat in his sleek office, the skyline mocking him through glass walls he had always thought symbolized control. Every email, every document, every ownership transfer Grace had executed without announcement pressed on him now with undeniable weight. He had believed his choices were independent, his ambition his alone. The illusion had been perfect, and now shattered. He scrolled through the files Grace had provided, his fingers pausing over each signature, each legal clause, each proof of ownership he had never imagined existed. Shock gave way to guilt, then finally to shame. He had allowed Olivia to overstep, had allowed himself to misjudge Grace's patience and foresight. And in doing so, he had walked blindly into a game he had never realized he was playing. "Grace," he muttered, almost like a whisper to the universe, "how did I never see this?" There was no answer but the soft hum of the city, and he didn't need one. The proof was in front of him. Every victory he had thought he'd claimed independently had quietly been structured, influenced, and ultimately owned by Grace Markson. Every assumption of freedom, every belief in separation from history had been false. Meanwhile, Olivia Gray experienced a far harsher confrontation with reality. Sitting at her apartment, coffee cooling in her hand, she stared at the documents on her phone, disbelief curling into panic. She had believed she had replaced Grace in James' life, had believed her energy, charm, and proximity had carved out space that belonged solely to her. And now, every assumption crumbled with brutal clarity. She had miscalculated. Every risk she had taken, every boundary she had ignored, every subtle crossing she had thought harmless now burned like fire across her consciousness. She had never truly claimed anything. She had only exposed what was never hers to hold. Her fingers trembled over the screen. Ownership, Grace Markson. Control, Grace Markson. Authority, Grace Markson. The reality hit like a tidal wave. Every interaction, every unguarded glance, every laugh she had shared with James, it had been meaningless in the face of truth. By mid-morning, James attempted to call Grace, fumbling through words that sounded rehearsed, weak, desperate. "Grace, I didn't know." "You did." Grace's voice was calm, deliberate. No anger, no accusation. Only the undeniable precision of someone who had anticipated this moment years ago. "You didn't, or you refused to see." James paused, swallowing. The answer was clear even to him. He had refused. He had been blind to her influence, blind to her control, blind to her patience. And now the consequences were irreversible. Grace continued, steady and controlled. The decisions were made, the documents executed, the truth is self-evident. There is no debate here, only clarity. James felt the weight of his mistakes settle like stone. He had allowed desire and distraction to cloud his judgment. He had failed to recognize loyalty, history, and foresight. And Olivia. Grace didn't need to mention Olivia. James already knew the cost. Meanwhile, Olivia's mind raced through every misstep, every assumption, every moment she had allowed herself to think she had agency. Rage flickered, then shame, then the hollow acknowledgement of defeat. She had acted without comprehension of the terrain, without awareness of the stakes, and now she faced the consequences of underestimating the one person who had always been 3 steps ahead. Grace's calm presence loomed over both of them, invisible yet undeniable. She had never shouted, never screamed, never demanded recognition. She had built quietly, strategically, and the revelation of paperwork had done more than confrontation ever could. Both James and Olivia were forced to reckon with truths they could no longer deny. Hours later, James sat alone in his office, staring at the city, replaying every choice he had made. He understood now the cost of his complacency, the fragility of assumptions, and the depth of Grace's quiet power. Every victory he had assumed was his own had been constructed on foundations he hadn't seen, and in failing to recognize them, he had surrendered more than he realized. Olivia, too, sat in silence, staring at her reflection in the window. The charm, the confidence, the audacity that had carried her this far felt shallow now, like fragile glass. She had wanted to step into power, into control, into influence, but she had only exposed herself to the full weight of Grace Markson's patience and strategy. Regret arrived, sharp and undeniable, but it came too late. And Grace Markson watched it all quietly. She didn't revel in their discomfort, she didn't gloat. She merely acknowledged the natural consequence of careful planning, observation, and timing. Those who underestimated her, who misread her patience and foresight, had learned their lesson. Not through confrontation, not through anger, but through undeniable proof, quietly and efficiently executed. In the stillness of her apartment that evening, Grace poured herself tea, reflecting on the day. Every betrayal, every assumption of victory, every misstep had been observed, catalogued, and finally resolved. She had not acted in haste. She had not allowed emotion to dictate moves. Instead, she had relied on patience, control, and quiet precision, her hallmark. She smiled softly, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the inevitable. Both James and Olivia would remember this day for the rest of their lives. They would understand, finally, that they had never truly owned anything they thought they had. Every illusion of power they had grasped dissolved under the weight of truth. Grace Markson, untouchable, unshaken, quietly sovereign, remained above all of it. And as the city pulsed below, unaware, she allowed herself one final thought. Regret comes too late always for those who underestimate her. She sipped her tea, the warmth a gentle counterpoint to the storm she had orchestrated. Outside, the lights blinked, people moved, life continued. But Grace remained, as always, untouchable, precise, and fully in control. The city was quiet that morning, unusually calm for a place that never truly slept. Grace Markson stood by her apartment window, sunlight spilling across the polished floor, lighting her reflection in the glass. For the first time in months, she felt no tension, no unspoken weight pressing against her chest. She had allowed the storm to come, watched it pass, and now, finally, she could breathe. James Banks had reached out again. This time his messages were carefully measured, apologies laced with regret, attempts at reasoning, even subtle pleas. Grace read each one in silence, a faint smile curving her lips. None of them mattered. His desire, his guilt, his confusion. These were reactions to her strategy, to her patience, to the quiet power she had always wielded. Nothing he offered could touch her. Olivia Gray, too, had attempted to reconnect, to apologize, to explain her misjudgment. She had understood at last that she had never owned anything that was never hers to claim. And yet, Grace didn't answer. She didn't lecture. She didn't need to. The lesson had been learned in the most undeniable way, through proof, patience, and the undeniable weight of her influence. Grace moved through her apartment with deliberate grace. Every piece of furniture, every object, every line of light felt like part of a world she had built and maintained with precision. It was hers entirely, untouched by betrayal, unaffected by desire, unshaken by ambition or mistake. She allowed herself the quiet satisfaction of a victory earned without confrontation, without drama, without compromise. She poured herself tea, the aroma grounding her. Her thoughts drifted briefly to James. He had been charming, capable, intense, but ultimately he had been part of a world she controlled quietly. He had never understood the full measure of her influence, and that was the point. Olivia, bright and bold, had misjudged her, assuming she could step in where boundaries had been unspoken but firm. Both had failed to see her truth. Grace sipped her tea slowly, enjoying the warmth that spread through her body. She reflected on the path she had taken, years of quiet accumulation, patient planning, discreet control. Each investment, each decision, each relationship had been carefully considered, never rushed, never exposed. And now the culmination of her work was clear. She was whole, untouchable, unshakable. She glanced at her reflection in the window, noticing the calm authority in her eyes. She had walked through betrayal, temptation, desire, and misjudgment, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more complete. There was no need to reclaim anything because what was hers had always been hers. The world could misunderstand, underestimate, or misjudge her, but Grace Markson knew her own value, her own power, and her own boundaries. The phone buzzed again, a message from James, carefully worded, cautious. She read it, let it sit on the screen, then deleted it without hesitation. There would be no dialogue, no attempt at reconciliation. That chapter had closed. Olivia's attempts were similar, messages filled with apologies, explanations, and tentative hopes. Grace did not respond. There was nothing to fix, nothing to negotiate, nothing to explain. She had watched, she had waited, and the truth had spoken for her. Both James and Olivia had been made to see the boundaries, the power, and the patience of a woman who had built quietly, deliberately, and completely. Grace walked to the balcony, letting the cool morning air brush against her face. The city stretched out below, vibrant, chaotic, oblivious to the quiet mastery she had maintained. She felt no fear, no longing, no attachment to what others had tried to claim. She had learned long ago that strength was silent, influence invisible, and power undeniable. Her gaze shifted to the horizon, the sun spilling gold over the skyline, a reminder that she was not just surviving, she was thriving. Every moment of doubt, every attempt to manipulate her world, every small betrayal had been absorbed and transformed into clarity, strength, and freedom. For the first time, Grace allowed herself to think beyond the immediate. Beyond James, beyond Olivia, beyond the illusions others had tried to impose. She could see her life in totality. The years of patient accumulation, the careful decisions, the quiet victories. Everything aligned perfectly. She had emerged not just unbroken, but whole. Her phone remained silent now, the texts and calls ignored. She had no desire for reconciliation, no need for validation. Grace Markson was complete in herself, a force of quiet authority. The betrayals, the crossed boundaries, the misjudgments of others, none of them had diminished her. They had only affirmed the precision of her choices. She poured the last of her tea into a delicate cup, watching the liquid swirl before taking a measured sip. The warmth was comforting, grounding, a private celebration of the woman she had always been, calm, capable, untouchable. Finally, she allowed herself a smile, soft, private, and entirely deserved. Grace Markson had walked through fire, observed the illusions of others, and emerged sovereign over her own life. There were no declarations, no confrontations, no arguments necessary. She didn't need them. Her quiet mastery was enough. She turned from the balcony, letting the city hum below, oblivious to the woman who had quietly orchestrated everything, remained untouched by betrayal, and walked forward with complete clarity. Grace Markson was whole, not because she had claimed anything from others, but because she had always claimed herself. And in that or me, the story ends, not with fury, not with revenge, not with chaos, but with the undeniable power of a woman who built quietly, ruled silently, and walked away fully intact. Grace Markson had won, not loudly, not publicly, but completely, and that was more than anyone could ever take from her.